Canola School on realagriculture.com is brought to you by Alberta Canola Producers Commission, Sask Canola, and Manitoba Canola Growers.
Joining us here at Canolab in Brandon, we have Rob Goulden of the University of Manitoba, and Rob talking about glyphosate-resistant kochia, which we're seeing more of in Western Canada. The whole idea of integrated weed management is critical for managing against this growing problem.
Yeah, that's right. We are seeing more glyphosate-resistant kochia in Western Canada. Certainly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they've have quite a number of confirmed sites. In Manitoba, it's increasing as well. We've got 2 confirmed sites in the eastern part of the province, and it looks like we may have a few more sites yet. What was interesting to hopefully lead into this discussion on glyphosate resistance and the importance of integrated weed management for that weed is that in Western Manitoba we actually found it, in Eastern Manitoba is where we found it in the original survey, and it is associated with row crops. So we saw it in a field of corn, and we caught it in a field of soybean. And that's where the role of integrated weed management becomes really important. Those row crops, those wide row crops, often don't fill in their canopy for the longest time in the season. And so weed management in those rows where there is no competition from the crop has to be done really 100% by the herbicide. The herbicide really doesn't get help from the crop, and that's probably one of the reasons why we are seeing some of those issues with glyphosate. In the US, they have a lot of experience with that as well. They have certainly got a lot of different glyphosate-resistant weeds or Roundup-resistant weeds, and many of them have been found in row crop systems selected for with repeated in-crop applications and heavy reliance on that technology. What's very interesting about kochia, and where perhaps integrated weed management is really critical, is that kochia has an interesting mechanism for resistance to glyphosate, and that is, as best as we know now, through gene amplification. And what that means is that it's a mechanism that's not typically inherited in a Mendelian way, and so the offspring of a resistant plant can be completely susceptible, range all the way from completely susceptible to all the way to highly resistant, and maybe even beyond what the maternal plant was. What that means is that within that spectrum of different resistances, we have different levels of injury of these kochia seedlings upon exposure to glyphosate. And as the copy number of that gene increases, their tolerance to glyphosate increases. But because we end up getting different levels of injury, here is where an integrated crop management program, or an integrated weed management program, I should say, is very important, in that if we have a very competitive crop that closes its canopy over top of those injured kochia seedlings, then it's going to compete very well with those injured kochia seedlings, and their chance of reproduction and seed production is pretty limited. On the other hand, if we have a row crop that's got wide row spacing, those seedlings that weren't killed by the initial dose of the herbicide, if we don't go in and do anything about that throughout the season, will eventually produce some seed, and then contribute to the problem in subsequent years. And so integrated management, where we make the crop as competitive as we can, even within the crop. And we know now through research that even relatively uncompetitive crops, if we use those integrated management tools of increased seeding rates, picking a variety that's maybe a little taller or has a little bit more leaf matter production, closes the rows faster, narrowing some of the row spacing, in addition to herbicides, can go a long way in reducing weed biomass of susceptible weeds, but also of resistant weed biotypes. And so overall, that's a very good strategy in hopefully reducing the risk of selecting for those in the first place, but also, if we do have those biotypes in the system, reducing their impact and allow producers to continue producing high-value crops with limited weed impact.
So what does that look like if we're talking about canola specifically?
In canola, what can you do from an integrated weed management point of view? We know that we can certainly produce canola at higher seeding rates. The beauty of canola is that it's highly plastic, and so in terms of just yield, it lets us get away with relatively low seeding rates. but that leaves a lot of holes in the canopy where some of those weeds could flourish if you don't have perfect weed control. The nice thing about canola and the plasticities is that if we bump up the seeding rates and we tend to have a more dense stand of canola, it's going to be, first of all, much more competitive with weeds. In extreme cases, if we have a really poor stand, sometimes we may need an additional in-crop herbicide application. That applies an extra selection pressure that we probably should be trying to avoid, and a higher density stand will certainly compete much better, may not need an extra in-crop application. The nice thing about high density stands of canola we've also found is that they tend to mature more quickly, and in our big harvest loss survey across farms in Western Canada, all of Western Canada, we surveyed 300 and some fields a few years ago, we found that any factor that contributes to earlier maturation of the canola and generally higher yield, good sound agronomy, and that also includes a dense stance of canola, that reduces harvest losses as well. So there's kind of a double bang for the buck there, in that more canola is hopefully being harvested and going in the bin, and less is going to be a future potential weed problem in subsequent crops. So using these integrated type weed management principles in canola has more benefits than just necessarily reducing herbicide application requirements and weed competition.
So finally, do you think there's progress being made in terms of adopting these practices and following these concepts with canola in Western Canada?
That's a very good question. I don't know is the real answer. I honestly don't know. I think as we start to experience perhaps more of these glyphosate-resistant and other herbicide-resistant weeds, it's something that producers hopefully will take a more serious look at. There's a lot of information out there. We certainly need to perhaps do a better job at the extension side of that. In terms of short-term thinking, there are often good arguments against it, seed cost being one of them. But those higher seeding rates usually and denser plant populations do provide very good biological insurance against some of these things, and oftentimes we maybe don't think enough of that, and think about some other benefits more quickly, and perhaps less so of the biological risk management rather than using technology to manage some of those risks.
All right. Thanks for your time, Rob.
Yeah, you're welcome.